My executive assistant was charging commissions to artists to guarantee their selection. I found out from a letter from a remorseful artist. What I found was a scheme that corrupted what matters most to me to defend. There are betrayals that hurt more than others, not because the amount is greater, but because the place where they happen is the place you have most wanted to protect. The mission of a cultural foundation is not abstract. It is the reason you accepted this job instead of another that paid better. It is the reason young artists who apply to your calls spend months preparing their projects. It is the reason donors who trust you decide to put their money in art instead of something else. And when someone uses that mission as cover for an extortion scheme, what they violate is not only trust. It is exactly what that mission promised to protect. Fair access, real meritocracy, the possibility that the best project is the one that wins. My name is Carlos. I am 49 years old. I am the director of Foundation Cultura Viva, a nonprofit organization that supports emerging artists and independent cultural projects through open calls, residencies, and direct funding. I have been in this position for 9 years. My executive assistant's name was Mariana. She was 43 years old. She had been with me for 5 years. She was the person who coordinated the administrative processes of the calls, who received applications, who managed communications with applicants, who handled jury logistics, who was, in the daily practice of the foundation, the point of contact between artists and the institution. The letter arrived on a Monday afternoon. White envelope, no return address on the outside. Inside were 2 handwritten pages. The artist who wrote the letter was named Diego. He was 28 years old. He had won one of our artistic residency calls 11 months ago. The letter said that before his application was reviewed by the jury, Mariana had contacted him by private message, that she had told him the selection process was very competitive, that there were ways to ensure his application received the right attention, that the amount was 8,000 pesos, that he had paid because he needed the residency and because he was afraid that if he did not pay, his project would not even be read, that he had won the residency, that since then he had lived with the discomfort of not knowing whether he had won because of his work or because of the payment, that he had decided to write because he believed what had happened was wrong, that he understood it could have consequences for him, but that he preferred to carry those consequences than to stay silent. The letter ended with his full name and phone number. I read the letter twice. The first time to understand what it said. The second to understand the extent of what it implied. If Diego had paid for his application to receive attention, and Diego had won the call, the question that no answer could simply close was how many others had paid, and how many had won because they had paid, and how many had lost because they had not paid. That last question was the one hardest to hold. I did not call Mariana that day. I did not call Diego that day. What I did was what corresponded to be done first. Call the president of our board of directors. Her name was Elena, and she had been in that position for 6 years. I read her the letter. Elena listened in silence. When I finished, she asked me what I needed from her at that moment. I told her I needed the board to be aware before any move, that what I did next would have consequences for the foundation, and those consequences needed the board support. Elena said I had all the support I needed, that I should proceed with the seriousness the matter required. I called Diego the following day, not to interrogate him, to thank him, to tell him what he had done required courage, to ask whether he would be willing to repeat what he had said in the letter formally if the process required it. Diego took a while to respond. He told me yes, that he had written the letter precisely because he was willing to stand by it. I asked him to preserve any evidence he had. Mariana's messages, payment records, any communication from the period before the call. Diego told me he had them, that he had saved them precisely in case he ever needed to show them. With that information, I proceeded with the appropriate process. I hired an external firm specializing in social sector audit to review the records of the last 5 calls. I did not tell Mariana what I was looking for. I told her it was a process audit for compliance with requirements from our international donors, which was not completely false. It was also completely insufficient as a description. The audit took 4 weeks. What it found was worse than Diego's letter had suggested. In 5 calls over the last 2 years, there was a pattern of informal payments corresponding to private communications between Mariana and applicants who had subsequently been selected. Not in every case, but in enough for the pattern to be clear. The total estimated amount of payments received by Mariana during that period was approximately 140,000 pesos, distributed across 19 documented or partially documentable cases. There is also something the audit determined that was perhaps more damaging to the Foundation's mission than the money itself. There were cases where people who had paid had been selected over people who had not paid and whose projects were objectively stronger according to the jury evaluation criteria. That meant the scheme had not only corrupted the process, it had changed the results. There were artists who had not received the support they deserved. There were projects that had not been developed. That was the harm that had no price. The confrontation with Mariana occurred in a meeting where Elena, the Foundation's attorney, and I were present. Mariana arrived knowing it was an important meeting, without knowing exactly what about. When we presented her with the audit findings and Diego's letter, she did not deny it immediately. She looked at the documents for a time, and then she looked at me. She told me it had started as something small, that artists arriving at the calls sometimes asked her for advice on how to better present their projects, that she had started charging for that advice informally, that over time the advice had evolved into something different, into an implicit guarantee she could not really give, but that artists wanted to believe she could, that she had taken that money knowing it was wrong, that she had not found a way to stop. I asked whether she had thought about what it did to artists who did not pay, who submitted their projects believing the process was fair, who lost without knowing they had lost on a tilted playing field that she had tilted. Mariana did not respond. That silence was the answer. Mariana was let go that day. Legal proceedings were initiated for fraud and breach of trust. The Foundation formally notified all applicants from the 5 affected calls, not with all the details of the scheme, but with the acknowledgement that there had been irregularities in the selection process, that the Foundation was taking corrective measures, that anyone who had had any irregular communication related to a call could contact us confidentially. That communique was difficult to write, and it was necessary. What followed was a review process of the selections from the 5 affected calls. It was not possible in all cases to determine with certainty whether the selection had been influenced by the payment. In some cases, it was possible. For artists who had been passed over in those calls and whose projects had received high scores from the jury were contacted. They were offered access to funding equivalent to what they had lost. 2 accepted. 2 had continued their projects by other means and no longer needed the support. Diego received formal communication from the Foundation acknowledging his courage in reporting, also acknowledging that the irregularity he had experienced should not have occurred. We offered him participation in an independent evaluation process of his project to verify that his selection had been genuine according to the jury criteria. He accepted. The evaluation confirmed his project had been selected on real merit. That result mattered to him in a way I understood completely when he called me to tell me he had received it. What we implemented afterward was concrete and was reviewed by our international donors as part of the transparency requirements we already had pending to strengthen. Complete separation between whoever receives and manages communications with applicants and whoever has access to evaluation processes. Anonymous irregularity reporting channel accessible to applicants from the moment a call is published. External audit of selection processes for each call before results are published. Direct communication of jury results to applicants without administrative staff intermediation. Those controls do not resolve everything. No controls resolve everything, but they directly address the mechanism that had allowed the scheme to operate for 2 years. What cost me most of the entire process was something that has nothing to do with Mariana specifically. It was the review period of the affected calls where I, director of a foundation whose reason for existing is precisely equity and access to cultural resources, had to sit with the possibility that in the last 2 years that access had been systematically compromised under my supervision. That possibility does not disappear when the process ends. It lives somewhere as the question that has no complete answer. How many projects were not developed? How many artists gave up because they believed the process was fair and that they had failed when in reality the process was not fair. Those people have no letter that can arrive at my office. And that is the harm that weighs most on me. What I want you to take from this story has parts for very different people. For those who lead social or cultural sector organizations, your organization's mission is not automatic protection against corruption. Sometimes it is exactly the cover that makes it possible. Because people inside the system know how much the mission matters to those who support it from outside, and can use that knowledge in ways the mission never contemplated. Controls in nonprofit organizations are not a symptom of distrust toward your team. They are the structure that protects the mission when trust fails. For artists and creators who participate in calls, if someone associated with an organization that is evaluating your project contacts you, informally suggesting there are ways to ensure your application receives the right attention, that is a warning sign that deserves to be reported to whoever leads that organization. Even if you're afraid of the consequences, even if you need the support, because silence is what allows the scheme to continue and for other artists to pay or lose in a process that should be fair. If this story impacted you, comment. Do you believe cultural and social sector organizations have sufficient controls to prevent this type of corruption, or does trust in the mission continue to be the main control mechanism? Like if you believe artists who report irregularities in selection processes deserve explicit protection and recognition. Subscribe for more real stories. Share with someone who works in the cultural sector or who participates in calls and who might benefit from knowing these warning signs. Practical tip. If you run an organization that holds competitive calls, make sure communication channels with applicants are clearly defined and that no team member can have private conversations with applicants about the selection process without that communication being recorded. Informality in those communications is exactly the space where this type of scheme can install itself.